When I was 12, I came into the conclusion that everyone in the world, including my own family, was against me. I was never a problem child, but my parents sure treated me like one. For an example, I used to need to be home by 5 p.m. every day. This clearly restricted the amount of playtime outdoors. I wasn't allowed to have friends over to play at their houses, nor I was allowed to go to anyone else's. I had to finish my homework directly after I came home from school, no matter how long it took. My parents refused to buy me video games and forced me to read books and then write a book report on them to prove I actually read it. Now, even though those rules listed above were quite frustrating to me, as a child, they weren't what upset me the most. What really hurt me was the lack of compassion on the behalf of my parents. My mother was a bitter woman who always made me feel guilty of accidents or mistakes I've made. My father only knew one emotion: frustration. The only time he spoke to me was when he screamed at me for receiving poor test scores or beat me for misbehaving. But enough about them. Let's talk about my school psychologist. For his own privacy, we will call him Mr. Tanner. Like most junior high schools, a psychologist who is always available on campus during school hours to assist any students in need of counseling, whatever it is, emotional, academic, social, behavioral, etc. To be honest, I've never seen any students talking with Mr. or Dr. Tanner every day. I would walk past his office on my way to the cafeteria and peek through his door's windows. He would always be alone in there, working on some paperwork. I guess that's where most kids were too afraid to speak about their problems to an adult who is practically a stranger. For this reason, it took me 3 weeks to muster enough courage to go into his office. March 2nd, 1993 was the day I decided to voice my troubles to Dr. Tanner. During lunch break, I stood in front of his office door and knocked. Through the window, I could see him raise his head, smile, and motion for me to come in. I did. He greeted me by introducing himself and asking for my name. Dr. Tanner had a very soft-spoken man who seemed to radiate kindness. In less than 30 minutes, I rambled to Dr. Tanner about how mean my parents were to me and how they didn't care about me at all. After a while, my voice began to quiver and I stopped speaking. The psychologist listened patiently to my whole spiel, arms folded and head nodding. I half expected him to talk about how everything I had just said was untrue and my parents loved me dearly and blah blah blah. But he didn't. Dr. Tanner leaned towards me with a grin on his face and said, "You know, I'm the best school psychologist in the world. I promise we will fix this." I rolled my eyes. "Okay, but how?" I asked. "I have my ways," he replied. "I'm a man of my word. I promise that within just 1 month, the relationship between you and your parents will change for the better, forever." After a brief pause, he continued, "Although I do need you to make me a promise. You have to promise me that you'll come back to my office after school tomorrow and that you won't tell anyone that we had this conversation today. It'll be our little secret." I promised. The following day, I returned to Dr. Tanner after school. It was around 4 p.m. when I entered his office. After a warm welcome, he asked me to have a seat in front of his desk once again. Upon sitting down, I watched Dr. Tanner close the blinds of the door's tiny window. "There," he smiled. "Now we shall have all the privacy we need." We began to talk about my likes and interests, my favorite subjects in school, my least favorite teachers, and the things I like. About an hour into the conversation, Dr. Tanner offered me a soft drink. I gladly took the offer, considering my parents never allowed me to drink soda. Dr. Tanner reached over to his mini fridge and fidgeted around before setting down 2 open cans of soda on the desk. Afterwards, we continued to talk about what was going on in my life, but it wasn't long before I passed out from whatever drugs Dr. Tanner had placed in my drink. It took me a minute or two to adjust my blurred vision upon waking, and when it did, I had no idea what to think. I was handcuffed to a bed and my mouth was sealed with duct tape. I immediately began to panic, squirming and tugging at my cuffs, but gave up soon after. My eyes widened in disbelief, looking around the room. There was posters of superheroes pinned up along the walls and photographs of famous athletes on shelves. In the middle of the room was an old television and a Super Nintendo, various game cartridges stacked alongside it. I didn't know what to think. Here I am in the room filled with items most kids would die to play with. I would have probably cried from the joy hadn't I have been cuffed to the bed frame. My stomach sank once again. As the door opened, Dr. Tanner walked inside. He sat down on the edge of his bed. "Now listen," he said. "Remember that I'm here to help you. I would never hurt you, all right?" Dr. Tanner gently removed the tape from my mouth and the cuffs from my hand. My first instinct was begin crying, but something about Dr. Tanner helped me feel safe. He smiled at me. "You're going to be staying here for a while," he continued, "and during this time, you're allowed to play with any toys in this room while I'm here at home. But when I leave this house, I'll need to cuff you to your hands back to the bed. You can still watch the television, but I only want you to watch the new channels when I'm away." I sat in silence, still trying to process the information he'd given me. "So," Dr. Tanner yipped, slapping me onto his knee, "you go ahead and knock yourself out. I'll be back when it's time for dinner." He got up from the bed and walked across the room and clicked on the TV's power button before locking the door behind him. Several more minutes passed before I realized that Dr. Tanner wasn't joking. All that was left for me to do was boot up the Nintendo and play Mario until nightfall. About 7 p.m., Dr. Tanner returned to the room, carrying 2 plates of mashed potatoes and chicken strips. I finally gathered up the courage to ask him how long I'd be staying in his room. "Well, about a month," he replied. "Give or take a few weeks. I just have to do some work I need to do." The following morning, I woke to Dr. Tanner's hand patting my head. "Hey, bud, you don't have to wake up right now, if you don't want, but I am going to need to put this back on," he whispered, clamping that he would steal the cuff into my wrist. I gazed up at him, and he was wearing a collared shirt and slacks, a coat draped all over his shoulder, and a suitcase to his side. He looked just how he always did when I saw him around school. Before leaving, he placed the TV's remotes next to me and told me to turn it on and watch the news. The first thing I saw upon turning it was breaking news segment, an important officer looking at the podium, surrounded by people with microphones. I happened to begin viewing halfway through his speech. "A statewide Amber Alert has issued this morning. We have several investigations working on identifying potential abductors, but as of right now, there is not much evidence. Faculty members state that the boy has last seen around 4 or 5 in the evening on..." I began to feel nauseous as the photograph of me appeared on the screen. It was my yearbook picture from last year. Captions for photograph displayed my name and age, my school and my town. Above my picture were the alternate titles: FBI begins search for child and kidnapping suspect unknown and potential runaway. The live footage continued of 2 figures. As soon as I recognized my mom and dad stepped up to the podium. Both appeared to have red eyes. Tears streamed down my mother's face as she took a hold of my microphone. I have never seen so much emotion came from my mother as before as she wept on the live television, stuttering on sentences such as, "Please return my baby back to me," and "I'm so sorry," and "Please come home to us." When my father took the microphone, I clearly expected his attitude to be stone cold, but he too had sad tears in his eyes. He pleaded the world to bring his own son home safely, and lastly begged for my forgiveness. I know I haven't been the best father, but god damn it, do I wish I had been now. Please bring my boy back. I turned the power off shortly after. My emotions were mixed, for I had never once seen my father cry. I felt miserable that my parents were being put through so much, but at the same time I felt relief. I know now how much my mom and dad love me. Nearly 4 weeks have passed, and Dr. Tanner has been treating me with the utmost respect. He leaves me in the morning cuffed to the bed frame, but returns in the afternoon to eat lunch and dinner with me, talk, play games. I would never have guessed how good Dr. Tanner was at Monopoly and Scrabble. But one morning when Dr. Tanner woke me up before heading to work, I noticed a stern look on his face. I also realized it was 3 hours earlier than when he usually woke me. "You need to watch the news today. No exceptions. I want you to keep the television on all day and pay close attention to it," he stated grimly. I, of course, complied and watched him exit the room. About 2 hours later, a breaking news segment interrupted the toothpaste commercial I was watching. The title, "Human Remains Found." 2 staunch-looking men in suits stood aside, and another began speaking. "We're displeased to bring up such unfortunate news this morning regarding a missing child case from earlier this month. One man bowed his head, while another one speaking shuffled through papers. He continued, "Remains of a body have been found in a garbage bag beneath the highway overpass. The body appears to be that of a child, although not much is left of it. The body has been decapitated and has much been burnt to ash and bone." The screen shifted over to a helicopter view of the freeway. Dozens of police cars gathered around the bottom of the tall overpass. The man's voice could still be heard. Within the bag, police have found junior high school identification card labeled as such. The screen showed the school ID I always kept in my backpack. The plastic was sort of melted away, but my photograph and name were intact. After the two men dismissed themselves, the camera panned over to my parents. They were sitting among reporters, and my mother's face held of a painful grimace, and my father sulked his head down at his knees. I shut the television off. Dr. Tanner returned home very late. He hurried to my room, unlocked my cuffs, and placed a bottle of fizzing water into my hand. He placed his hands on my shoulder and smiled. "I made a promise, didn't I?" I nodded, tears squeezing their way out of my eyes. "You need to make a promise again," he whispered. He told me that I needed to drink all the water in the bottle. It would help me sleep, and that from there on, I am never to tell anyone that I ever met him. I promised. "I told you I'm the best school psychologist in the world, didn't I?" And he was right. I awoke sometime later to find myself lying in the middle of the park, stars shining brilliantly across the night sky. I recognized the park. It wasn't too far from my school. A mile or so down the road I saw my house. The lights were off inside, but I could make out my father sitting on the step leading to the front door. I hesitantly called out for him. He lifted his head slowly, but when he saw it was me, he sprang to his feet, ran towards me with arms open, yelling my name. My mother erupted from the house behind him. Dr. Tanner was right. Things have changed with my family and I. My parents smile more often and treat me lovingly. I could not ask for a more perfect ending. Every now and then, I see Dr. Tanner on campus, talking to and from his office, rarely to do whatever made eye contact, let alone speak to one another. But sometimes he'll shoot me a wink and a smile. I'll always keep my promise to him and pretend I never met him. But there I will always be one question, ever floating in my mind. Who did Dr. Tanner decapitate and throw over the overpass? What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video. And I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, please stay pretty.